Um, Good afternoon, members. Welcome to you and invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Education Panel. The purpose of the meeting today is to put questions to our guests on the devolution of the adult education budget to the Greater London Authority. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag AssemblyEdu. And the first item on our agenda is apologies for absence. Welcome to you, Polly.
Yeah, we received apologies for Assembly Member Arbour-Chair.
Thank you. And item 2, can I ask the panel to note the list of offices held by members as set out in the table at item 2 as disclosable pecuniary interest. Okay. Can I ask members if they have any additional interest in specific items listed on the agenda? None. And then item 3, minutes. Can we please agree the minutes of our last meeting held 13 September 2018? Agreed, thank you. And then item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we please note our list of completed actions? Noted. And item 5, the mayoral response to the panel's report. Can we please note the response from the mayor? And Polly, have we had anything other? We've got nothing late arrivals. No, thank you. And just for note, that the response I'm talking about was relating to the panel's work on special educational needs and disabilities in London. And then item 6, devolution of the adult education budget to the GLA. And this is our main item of business today, the devolution of the adult education budget to the Greater London Authority. Wow, it seems like we've been on this road for quite a long time, since the announcement, the planning, and here we are.
2.5 years later.
2.5 years later, I can't believe it. And we're seeing the final. The ribbon is there to be cut, isn't it? Yeah. So let us welcome our guests. And it's a pleasure to welcome Jules Pipe, CBE, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, and Michelle Cuomo Boorer, Assistant Director, Skills and Employment at the GLA. Thank you very much, both of you. And let's then go to our questions. And I'm saying questions because we have had some time with both of you just before for an update. So let's go then. And we've got 3 areas of questions for you. And then what we'll do is we'll break them up between members. So the first area that I want us to address is around devolution and delivery plans. And the question to both of you is, are you on track for a 1st August start? What are the main risks and challenges that you have identified?
Yes, we are firmly on track. There are any number of stages that we can talk you through about that we've undertaken in putting all things in place. The funding agreement has been signed between the Mayor and the Secretary of State. There are all sorts of procedures and structures that have had to be put in place to satisfy the department. One of the last things we're putting in place is the audit for the delegated AEB, and arrangements for that are being finalised and expected to receive mayoral approval in April of this year. There's been a delay because there's been something of a discussion between us and the ESFA about the degree of audit required. Our standards here at the GLA are very high on audit, and there was only a certain degree of audit that was going to be offered by ESFA, so we've had to kind of resolve that.
Michelle?
Well, I think, as Jules said, we're definitely on track. It feels like we're in the final kind of stages now of getting ourselves ready. We have delivery teams in place who are going out meeting with all of our providers, all of our grant providers, and we are in the final stages of the procurement of around 10% of the budget. So, and we expect those that procurement to be ending around April, so which will give us a significant amount of time to make sure those providers are onboarded and brought on ahead of the August delivery.
Lovely. I mean, going back to what you said about audit, Jules, I mean, I remember the real problems we had with poor audit systems in the past with LDA funding and, you know, all the work that had to be done to deliver a system where we are now. So it's encouraging to hear you say that this is the level that you intend to operate at, because I think that will be reassuring.
Yeah. There are a large number of providers out there, and we need to make sure that they're all in good, robust health financially and in terms of governance to make sure that the money is being effectively spent.
Absolutely, because nobody wants to fail, really. We don't want anybody to fail. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Susan.
Hello. In our pack, we are told you're expecting 311 million per annum, and that's for 3 years.
And that's an annual
per
budget.
Yes, per annum
yeah.
for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when do you expect to get that confirmation?
We're hoping that it should be by tomorrow. It's a coincidence that it happens to be tomorrow in relation to today's committee hearing. But we are expecting 24%, the same 24% that's been spent in London previously of the national budget. And so that means we should be seeing £311 million come to London each year. And the DFE have provided an indicative an indication of that will be the amount, but final confirmation will come tomorrow.
Okay, if it doesn't come tomorrow, clearly there's a lot depending on you getting this funding. How long will you leave it before you chase up, get concerned, etc.?
I think we've been chasing for probably several years actually about confirmation on exactly what it.
So the Mayor signed earlier this month the delegation agreement and the memorandum of understanding that underpins the devolution or delegation of the adult budget to London. Within that, it stated we should know our budget. The commitment from government was by the 31st of January. So we are fully expecting that budget to arrive tomorrow, and we've had ongoing discussions with officers at the DFE to ensure that that is given to us fairly smoothly. We don't know obviously what that is yet, but we expect it to be around that 311.
Okay, I mean clearly there's a cost of administrating all of this. What do you assume the cost will be?
Unfortunately, the budget is coming to us without the administration costs funded by central government. Clearly, they have incurred costs in running it from the ESFA, but they're not transferring those funds to us with the actual learners' budget. The Mayor has been determined to date to fund the implementation costs from either from City Hall funds, wherever possible. There was a small amount of several £100,000 given by central government and the department for sort of implementing the devolution, sort of putting some of the structures in place. But the ongoing running costs will either have to be found by City Hall, or inevitably some may have to be top sliced from the budget, which would be around 1%. And that has been in the public domain previously, because the Mayor has been campaigning and lobbying, I should perhaps say, the department over funding these costs and transferring what must be inevitably being spent within the SFA on this area currently, to get that transferred to London. But so far we haven't been able to achieve that.
Okay, so if it's 1%, if not, we understand that you've been told that you can keep the underspends.
That's a slightly different issue. What is common, obviously, in many areas of funding and governance is that if an area underspends at the end of the year, then by the end of the year, then the following year's budget is reduced by that amount of underspend. And that would have applied in this case to the devolved AEB. Clearly, that's not in London's interest to lose any money, and there can sometimes be good reasons why one might underspend. Colleges or providers could underspend for reasons beyond their control. Also, in terms of being able to use the budget more creatively and over projects that go on for a longer time period and not defined by simply the financial years, it gives you that flexibility. Michelle?
Yeah, so just to add to that, I mean, I think this has been a real success of the negotiation around the adult budget in the fact that if we do underspend, we will be able to keep our underspends moving forward, which means that we're not at the risk of losing funding to London. We will be given the same proportion of budget has been agreed at the start of this process, no matter how we perform in that way. And as Jules said, there could be very good reasons. For example, if you move to a different funding model where funding may not be spent in exactly the same way as it is now. So actually it isn't underperformance, it's just a different profile of spend.
Yeah. And if that profile doesn't match that sort of March to April financial year, there shouldn't be any penalty just because it ends up being a kind of a May to June profile. So.
But nevertheless, the DfE has stated that the GLA can keep its underspends.
Yes. Yeah, which is very positive.
Okay. I mean, do you know, given that budget, how much in previous years that would have been an underspend? No, not off the top of our heads. But as I say, there could be all sorts of different reasons. So to date, in the way that it's been run by ESFA at the moment, there could be negative reasons for underspend and to be, being ineffective and be, in its distribution, or there could be equally good reasons why, and the reasons that I've just outlined that we could foresee it not being spent. So, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess.
No, and it's also probably fair to say it's not a like-for-like budget. So the budget currently is national. Providers.
Yes, I didn't know whether you'd been able to extrapolate.
The way, not really, because it is a national budget and people.
No, I accept that. I didn't know if any work had been done on that. How many members of staff are going to be administrating this budget?
It's about 70 in total, isn't it?
No, it's less than that. So,
well, that's all the skills team. It's not necessarily just the AEB budget.
No, it's not. So we have a team of 70 people. They're not all funded by they're definitely not all working on AEB. The Mayor has several manifesto commitments, for example, around apprenticeships, SEND provision that we've spoken about, which fall outside of the adult education budget entirely. So they are separate, although obviously because we spoke about having a holistic system, we want a holistic team. So we have the adult budget sits alongside other manifesto commitments within that. We do have 2 delivery teams that are working exclusively on the adult budget. They're broadly around 15 people each in each of those teams. But when you look at the number of providers that's servicing, that actually isn't over and above. The other thing we do have, obviously, is European funds. So some of our individuals we use the management funding from ESF to help fund those staff as well. So it's a combination.
So there's definitely 30, and the use of other people in the meantime.
Sorry, and the whole team is wider than that, and that the funding for those individual members of staff is dependent on the different areas of work that they are working on.
So my answer was the whole skills team as a whole, but if it's simply just the AEB budget management,
we
then
can clarify that number, but it's around. It's definitely not 70.
No, that's the total skills team.
No, but I mean clearly you'd want to drill down on that to make sure where your costs were linked to which budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it safe to say less than half?
About half.
About half the team, one could say, are dedicated to AEB related work.
Okay, so we can settle on 35, can we?
We can clarify.
Yeah, but we'll clarify that. For the sake of any further discussion, let's assume it's around that number.
Okay, thanks. Jeanette.
Okay, yeah. Well, what we can have, maybe for the minutes, is a sort of overview chart, organisational chart that shows that. And also going back to the letter, if you could let us have a copy of that, and then we can add it as an appendix.
So the delegation letter.
To our minutes. So now, Jules, last year you told us there was untangling to do around subcontracting and outer London providers. Are you any clearer now about the role of outer London providers in supporting the delivery of adult education services in London?
It's a work in progress and will be going forward for quite some time. I think in an ideal world, we would have been able, sort of several years ago, to have been kind of monitoring how spend was being made, what different organisations were delivering for London that were in receipt of funds that are earmarked for London spend. But unfortunately, it's been something of a black box in a way, really, hasn't it? That really hasn't been. We haven't been able to open until, well, effectively next the autumn of this year. So it's really actually in the doing that we'll be discovering, rather than during the preparation, discovering what exactly providers are delivering. When you think that the situation we're inheriting is some 400 providers, 300 of them actually not based within London. So, I mean, many of those will actually be delivering in London. It won't be people leaving the boundaries of London, but they will have taken on these contracts and have got some arrangement, whether it's within existing colleges and through them, or whether it's securing their own premises, or whatever arrangements. But it's that kind of unpicking that we have to do on this sort of myriad, sort of 400 different arrangements going forward. I mean, obviously, we would want to see justification for why things aren't being spent through London institutions. There may be good reasons, and we might want to continue them, but they need to be justified. If there are any subcontracting arrangements that are resulting in this, again, we would want to understand why those were necessary and what the costs of those subcontracting arrangements are, all to be justified. I say we would have much preferred to have untangled all this before we actually take direct responsibility on it, but as I say, it simply hasn't been possible.
Yeah. So, and that makes sense, doesn't it? Because you're just inheriting this bundle. Incredible number, 300, if you like, based outside London. But if they've got the quality, then in the past they've been used, which also makes sense. So
it might be the case that all their actual provision on the ground is based within London, in London premises, and it just might be their head office is actually based outside of London, but it's all that's got to be untangled.
Because I was just coming to that, because there's this whole thing, isn't there, that there's let me think of it. University of West of England in London, because it's got a post box, and it's then marketed itself as being a London university. Have you seen that phenomena?
I think the way the sort of indicative budget has been given to us is based on the residents of London. So the people that are being delivered to are in London.
Right.
So they are located in London. The lead provider, the person that the college institution that we can see, the top line, may well be somewhere else in the country. What we can't quite establish is what sits beneath that. So either they are, like that example, they're delivering directly in London, and that's absolutely legitimate, or they are subcontracting to could be highly likely a London provider to deliver that provision. Because the budget has previously been national, it's very hard to disaggregate the national kind of delivery from pure London delivery.
Yeah, because the more they subcontract, then they're accruing management costs, aren't they? I mean, we saw this in European funding some while back, didn't we? Where people were then getting 40%, and in my constituency I knew some groups that were really getting, crumbs by the time it had been subcontracted. So that is an issue that we'll want to come back to to just, and it goes back to audit as well, doesn't it? Yeah. Oh, Susan, yeah.
Can I just ask a question? Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Just how many times can, if a contract is awarded, just how many times can it be re-subcontracted?
Well, I think there's a difference between tiers of subcontracting and how many partners you can have delivering. So one tier, so you can subcontract to one, but you can have multiple across.
Yes,
So you could have 20, I mean, I don't suggest anyone does have that, but you could have 10, 15 separate subcontractors that sit beneath your contract. In the past, there were limited restrictions from the ESFA on how that was managed due to the sort of freedoms and flexibilities that are introduced to the adult budget. What we've proposed is two things. One is a sort of 20% cap on that management fee that's applied. I think we're the first area to do that of all the devolved authorities. And then the second thing there is that every provider needs to tell us who they're working with up front so that we can see who that they're planning to work with throughout the year. Obviously, there will be subcontracting that happens throughout the year where there is particular niche provision or provision that is really required for an individual learner and a provider needs to bring somebody in. But that conversation will happen with the delivery team, so it's more of a conversation about that rather than it happening without any visibility.
Okay, and they then won't be able to charge the percentage, the 20% down the line?
Well, they would
will
20% management fee cap, so that's the top level they'll be able
and
to
the
charge.
total.
Yeah.
That's good. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, so important that you stay on that because then it fits in with, good employment practices, the work that you've been following, Fiona, and the Mayor's commitment to that.
Probably worth saying as well, just to add that 20% wasn't randomly thought up in City Hall. That was upon the advice of provider groups, so HOLEX for one, and the Adult Learning ALP, who suggested 20%, having done a research report into that. That's what they suggested was a good number.
Good. And by now you've got an idea about those who will be receiving grants. I suppose you've got letters that it will follow. You get your letter and then contractors and those fortunate enough to get a grant will be getting their letters. What's been the feedback from the providers about the process so far?
It's been very positive. I think initially, when the idea of devolving the budget was brought forward, I think there was concern, something new, new arrangements. I suppose always prompts that. But I think the sector has been pleasantly surprised about how it's gone, and I think they're really they're really valuing the engagement that there is between the staff and the here at City Hall and the providers, and the kind of the dedicated interest in what London needs and having that conversation with providers, whereas obviously that's not something a kind of a more national approach can facilitate.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, we've done a few things really to build those relationships. So we published the Skills for London's framework in the summer, which was a consultation piece around how should we spend the adult budget. We had some really good feedback within that, and that feedback we took on board. So things like the subcontracting fees, and actually the introduction of fully funding for sign language came directly from that consultation. We're also planning to do running a similar consultation this spring, summer, again to inform future funding of the AAB in 21-22, the following year. And actually one of the very positive things about GLA having the funding come in is the relationships that, as Jules has said, officers can now have with providers, so we can really understand how they're delivering, and also the needs of London in a very much more in-depth way than has previously happened. And we're getting very positive feedback about that.
Lovely. And we share the concerns from the FE providers that at the start or they weren't on the boards. How did you resolve that, Jules?
Yes, that we've got quite a complex governance arrangement for to oversee AEB. and they are now fully involved in that structure. I probably need to refer to the structure chart actually to say how it all fits in, but the title of the board that they are on, alongside representatives from the sub-regions, the political sub-regional groups from the boroughs. So you have the representatives of about 5 provider groups, the 4 political sub-regions, and business as well.
And they
And then also there's actually a business board, a
Yes.
dedicated business board
Yes.
that will contribute into the mix about what skills training they need to be performed in the capital as well.
Yeah. And do they feature on the mayoral board, or is it by that time they really shouldn't be there because they should stay advisory because they're delivering, and so the governance and the decision making it would just create a little bit of conflict?
Yeah, they're entirely conflicted, really, if you look at it. So every member of the Skills for Londoners board is delivering provision. That includes local authorities as well, to a certain extent, well, to a large extent. So they
Adult community budget.
Yeah. So they are deliberately separated from the mayoral board, which is the formal decision-making process. However, clearly they advise that meeting.
And really, that the mayoral, the mayor obviously takes an interest throughout the entire process, and particularly, the agenda that we'll be developing about priorities. But actually, the mayoral board at the end of the day is part of the process to ensure transparency and proper governance. But it's not the place where the kind of the direction and nature of funding is developed. It's really a signing off board rather than a deciding direction board.
It's probably also worth saying that beneath the main Skills for Londoners board, which we have obviously 5 provider representatives and the local authorities there, we also have a number of subcommittees. So one being on outcomes, we have apprenticeships, we have the other ones that sit beneath that, and those are made up of a much wider network of providers who volunteer their time to come and sit and shape that before that goes up to the main Skills for Londoners board.
Thank you for clarifying, because that was outstanding from our previous meetings. We now have David and yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I just wanted to pick up on something Assembly Member Hall was asking you about earlier in terms of the administrative staff and the budget for looking after this. And you mentioned there's going to be about 1% top slicing, which is about 3 million. I imagine that's what 1% is approximately. And you mentioned 35 staff. Well, 35 into 3 million goes about £86,000. So that's £86,000 per member of staff. How do you justify that much?
Let's clarify the number of staff, I think. But that budget, that administration budget, isn't just about staff. So we mentioned earlier audit. It is highly likely that we will have to pay for audit out of that funding. We will highly likely have to pay for Ofsted inspections for providers that aren't inspected by the ESFA. So there are a number of other additional costs that will be incurred which are not staff related.
Okay. Have you got any sort of figure for the audit and the Ofsted inspections?
We haven't at the moment because we're still negotiating that with government.
Okay, and Ofsted is normally something that's paid for by the schools and the colleges that have it, isn't that right? I mean, how many would you have to pay for?
Again, we don't know at the moment, because what we are all going through, all of the MCAs and government, is a procurement process. So government have committed around Ofsted to continue to Ofsted inspect those institutions that they have a relationship with. For those institutions they don't have a relationship, which could be a number, considering some of those providers will only deliver in London moving forward. We are looking around that. So we don't know the number at the moment.
Okay.
We're in the middle of that procurement process.
Right. When it comes back to the staff, the 35 staff, can you give us a figure of the average salary that they will be on?
Well, they are a range of grades. We can clarify the number of staff, and I would also say that it isn't as simple as one person working on AB. As I said earlier, some of those are offset with ESF costs, so there are percentages of people across those as well.
I mean, I'm asking obviously because these are things that you don't have a final figure on. So if we can get that 3 million administrative cost down, then that would be a good thing. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah. We deliberately haven't recruited into the full number of staff as well. So we came to oversight last year for the establishment of the Skills and Employment unit, which included obviously people working on other things as well. We had deliberately haven't recruited the maximum of people in those delivery teams, precisely because we don't know quite what we're going to have at the end in terms of delivery. So we are very, very conscious.
We can keep it smaller without making people redundant.
It may well be smaller than 35, and that then will go down.
Obviously, if we have more money, it may well then fluctuate with that.
Well, we want the money to be spent on students, so rather than administrative costs. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Fiona?
Thank you, Chair. At the risk of sort of taking you off onto bits that aren't in the agenda, I want to talk about future devolution while we're just sort of talking about budgets, particularly around the fact that I think there's been some recent research in which found that about 50% of employers who pay the apprenticeship levy aren't anticipating spending it. A large proportion of employers who pay the levy regard it as an additional tax, and we're still seeing fewer apprentice starts, and still seeing the practice of rebadging sort of managerial level in-work training as sort of apprenticeships. Is this something that you're actively exploring with government in terms of looking at whether it'd be more efficient and more effective to devolve at least part of the budget to London?
Yes, it's something that we've been pressing for consistently over the past few years. It's obviously very separate to this budget.
I appreciate that.
It would be good to be able to ring fence a pot for London, but that's exactly what does not happen. It's the government firmly regard it as a national budget, and interestingly, you say about a tax, actually, in the way that it is taken from employers, it is actually done in very much a way that a tax does, and that there isn't any kind of notional regionalisation to it. The government would say that numerous employers, particularly the larger ones, have even if they're based in central London, their employees are scattered across certainly at least the southeast, and therefore they and because it's effectively a tax on headcount, they have used that as one of the justifications for not hypothecating a particular a greater London pot. So really, what we are doing, we're encouraging employers sort of effectively to create accounts that the money could be paid into, and therefore that they could draw down that. So there is a way in which a degree of hypothecation to specific employers, which would work for larger employers, and then in that way we could get them to work with SMEs that and smaller organisations that aren't actually paying into the pot, but being able to draw down from that London pot.
Excellent, thank you.
Michelle?
I think that's
lovely. Well, then let's look at priorities for reform. Susan, first question to you.
Are the commitments to fund learners who are employed in a low pay and a British Sign Language courses a permanent change?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Lovely.
Sorry, I'm struggling to give a more expansive answer than that.
No, don't struggle, please. Yes is good.
We love yes answers.
And how will the changes affect funding for providers?
So what for British Sign Language and
those learners who are employed in a low pay.
Oh right. Well, on low pay, I mean that is going to have a big impact, both on the ability for those in work but above the previous threshold
to access courses, and a huge difference to colleges as well. I was speaking to one principal recently who it's transforming their ability to be able to attract new learners, and obviously one of our principal tasks that we're taking on is to not just get people into work, but get progression for those people in low-paid work. So to moving that threshold, I think is going to prove very effective in enabling those people to take up courses that otherwise they weren't. And there's anecdotal evidence out there that over sort of the past 7 or 8 years, there has been this kind of tail off in people who are not eligible for free courses, a tailing off of those people taking up college opportunities, because as their household incomes get squeezed, it's just it's a burden that they can't really bear. So actually making them more accessible in this way is this, as I say, I've already been given anecdotal evidence that is seeing in some colleges who are responding to this kind of new funding regime, but the freedom that the government recently gave them, and then the impending freedom that we're giving them, taking it up to the London living wage level, to effectively widen participation hugely.
Yep, no, very good. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then the other development is the move to an outcome-based commissioning system. So tell us briefly about the consultation process and really what will you get in addition to, if you like, numbers of jobs from this approach?
Well, we want to work really closely with all the providers in the coming years to develop quite what this approach looks like. It can't be a crude sort of payment by results approach. What are those results? We need to think carefully, work with providers and sort of obviously service users and with business to understand what people's needs are, what the kind of impacts. That's the key thing, because I think we're often talking more now about impacts rather than simply outcomes. So it's not just simply a piece of paper, a qualification in some cases. Clearly, the more sort of the goal-centred things about passing a qualification for a particular trade, for example, those are easier to measure. The other end of the spectrum, you've got more social outcomes that some of these courses are providing. And it's not necessarily work-focused, but more kind of engagement, keeping people active within the community.
Yes, I think a key difference perhaps about the move of the adult budget to London from the national position is that focus really on impacts and outcomes. We have got, as I mentioned earlier, a subcommittee of the Skills for Londoners Board, which is focusing entirely on what those outcomes/impacts should be for London. We're taking a 3-stage approach. As soon as you mention the word outcomes, people think work programme, they think payment by results, they think this is going to be incredibly hard, and actually what's the benefit? What we've tried to do is take everyone right back to the beginning. So what are the outcomes and impacts we want to measure? Very clearly there's some sort of straightforward outcomes, which are job outcomes or further learning. But what is really important, and I think we should highlight in the adult budget, is it doesn't just fund job outcome. It doesn't just do that. There's work for providers in that in terms of collecting the information, or it could be that the Mayor creates some kind of survey to measure from London, those learners that have taken up any of the adult budget, what they're doing. So there's a lot of work around that. How on earth do we measure this? The third stage of that then is the kind of slightly more scary bit to I think most providers is the payments. What we have said very clearly is we're not saying we're going to shift the whole budget to an outcome payment system. And maybe we do. Maybe through this work we find that. But I think it's more likely that there'll be a much more nuanced approach to that. And some things will lend themselves far more naturally to that approach than other things. So we're taking quite a cautious approach. We've got a really engaged outcomes group. Angus
Knowles Cutler
Knowles
from
Cutler.
he's on the lead.
Okay, yeah, of the LEAP, is leading that group, and he's already been really surprised and welcomed that surprise that the adult budget is far more than just about jobs outcomes. Actually, there's a whole wealth of other activity that it funds that is really, really important, and we need to keep a focus on.
Yeah, well, of course, we've welcomed the development of the 8 areas of reform from the Skills for London framework, especially the area identified for people with SEND, which we've championed. And what you've said follows on from our experience of hearing from that group, is that if you were measuring impact on jobs, then you wouldn't really be going very far, because for areas like that, and I should imagine mental health, although I haven't done any in-depth work on that, then we're talking there about social and well-being impact. And that leads me to then, how would the budget then, and I suppose this is something you'll have to learn, because if you saw that, then isn't that then a recurring funding for those individuals locking up the system? Do you know what I mean? I mean, if it's working for them,
Well,
then
partly,
that should continue.
Yeah, I mean, partly that we are already funding outcomes and impacts. We
Yes.
know that people don't just take on a qualification well, some people might do, but the majority aren't just doing it for the sake of it. There is an impact to that learning which we're not measuring. So one of the things we've discussed with that group is, you're already doing this. What are the what drives you as sort of educators to work with those individuals? What are the impacts? What are the outcomes you're seeing that we just simply don't have visibility of? And I think that's probably the key difference, the recognition that there is some amazing work going on, but how do we really draw that out, and how do we do more of that? And how do we make sure that we don't leave people behind that may well, by some of the unintended consequences of the rules, not be able to access this funding? I think the living wage is a good example of that. We've raised it up to that to bring more people into this, to support them.
Yes, I mean, I remember we visited the college, Morley College, and where we met some women, young women, mature women, and for them that college was a godsend, because it was about social and health and well-being, and then, you know, with the prospect for the younger age group of skills. So we'll be monitoring the development of that approach. And then lastly in this section, we were invited and attended the Mayor's SEND review, and I personally was very receptive of that report. Have you spent some time picking up any recommendations from that review, which I have to say seems fit in with the recommendations that the Mayor accepted from our work?
Well, the Mayor will be using the findings of that post-16 SEND review, as a starting point, really, to develop a more inclusive adult education system with the devolved budget. Obviously, the review 16 plus. This budget is for 19 plus. It's a broader review than covers a much broader area of provision than's covered by this budget.
Yeah. But ESF covers 16.
Yeah.
So you've got the ability, given that ESF is in your team, to actually do that work, which is good news.
Yes.
Thank you. So, any other questions on that section? No? So let's go to our third and final section, and that's, oh gosh, because you cannot have a meeting or a day without mentioning the blessed Brexit. So, EU exit and London skills demand. Over to my colleague Fiona for the lead-off question.
Thank you. How will the AEB align the support it can provide to the identified gaps in the labour force that the White Paper on Immigration has identified?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly it's a big issue for any number of sectors in London. 50% of the workforce in construction, made up of EU workers. When you look across health and social care, through to hospitality, an enormous number. And so, even without Brexit, a lot of the agenda that we're trying to cover with the AEB going forward, we should have been doing that anyway. We should have been skilling up more people as a nation to work in these sectors, particularly construction. So in some ways, sort of Brexit is almost just a kind of an acute kind of wake-up call to what we should have been doing anyway. However, the accelerated nature of it has the potential for a real problem. It's going to be very difficult to keep up with the speed of loss, probably that may happen in the coming years. Clearly, construction is a major concern to the mayor because of the need to build homes. It's the biggest problem we face in London. And so without skilled workforce, we're going to have, however much money we have to build homes, we're not going to be able to deliver them without that workforce. So that's why the mayor's created the construction academy to take that forward, and the some of the skills capital budget has been ring-fenced to invest in construction training colleges in the facilities. And so really that's kind of part of the kind of patchwork of work that's being taking place to kind of fill those gaps. But those sort of principal areas have been identified as part of the Skills for Londoners programme.
And you mentioned the construction academy, the need to sort of skill up workers within that sector. If it becomes an acute issue in terms of building the homes that London needs, is it possible to scale that up, or is it sort of are the plans in place already to scale it up depending on the size of the gap to try and get more people through quicker if that starts becoming an acute problem?
The framework that's been put in place and the network, and such as the hubs, which are effectively coordination hubs between skills providers, construction industry organisations, and young and indeed any age that would want to engage in the construction sector, and actually coordinating all that to increase numbers. Although we are funding it and have put this in place, really it's something that should be happening anyway within industry. So really it's kind of, we're not calling it a pilot, but in a way it's got to become self-funding and therefore self-scaling in a way. So it's got to prove its worth in the fact that it does get more people in, it does make the connections between the colleges, industry, and willing employees and students. And if it proves its value, then it should become, as I say, self-sustaining and expand to fill the necessary gap.
Yeah, and looking out the window, obviously we can't through the blinds, but there's always a lot of cranes in London. We always used to be told that you couldn't actually learn how to operate a crane in London. And that most of the crane drivers therefore came from overseas. Is that something that you're addressing as a matter of urgency?
I couldn't say that particular specific.
I don't know the specifics about crane.
Yeah, it used to always come up as something that was a particular example of what you couldn't learn either in London or in the UK, and that it was a particular skill that was lacking. I just wondered, because obviously if you can't get the crane drivers or crane operators, you've got a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's all sorts of anecdotal evidence about sort of the particular age of regardless of Brexit, the age of particular skilled operatives within the construction sector that are reaching a particular age, and there are all sorts of things that are behind the issues that we face in the construction sector. It as a sector, it is not best. It's not well served by its image. and trying to get a greater range of people, particularly young women, interested in the sector is a real challenge, and it's one that the Mayor wants to see London rise to.
Yeah, great.
Okay, David.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Arnold mentioned that we'd been to Morley College to talk to some students there, and I was there on the trip we did, and one of the things that we had a conversation about was careers advice, and some of the students there were telling us, which I think is a general issue, that there's so many providers, but I think there's about 240 careers providers, as well as a national career service. On one extreme, if you like, there's too much choice for people to sort of be able to know where to access the system. And on another level, some people say that some of the providers they go to are too prescriptive and don't give students the advice that they need. So what will the AEB do? How will you be able to use it to help students to get the careers advice that they need and to improve careers advice in London, particularly if they're changing career or if they're at a key age or a key transition point?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point. It's one of those parallel pieces of activity that we've been engaged in about trying to get agreement from the government to devolve the advice and guidance funding for London, so that then that could operate in parallel with the AEB. At the moment, it is a national service, nationally procured. It's claimed that there are opportunities for input from London to shape it, but we think that they're too minimal to actually have any real effect.
Yeah, the Mayor also published in November last year the Careers for Londoners Action Plan, which makes a series of calls on government, employers, schools, other universities, other institutions around this. But obviously the careers funding does sit entirely separate to the adult budget. This does then kind of lead to the discussions around the budget. The adult budget that we're receiving is a small part of a much wider skills system. As we mentioned earlier, apprenticeships sit separately, careers sit separately. And so there is a sort of call from the Mayor to bring all of these budgets together to create that holistic system that really works for Londoners.
So I'm sort of hearing there that you would agree, and the Mayor would agree, that something needs to be done, but it sits with central government rather than with the adult education budget.
Yeah,
Is that
an agreement to devolve it. Meantime, let's say the Mayor has been taking steps as he's able to, as Michelle has said, including the expansion of the advisor network in schools as well, so that every school who wants one can now have an advisor involved in their school and helping to advise young people.
Is that something, though, that would have to be funded by the DFE, or is that something?
No, well, I mean, that's being funded part LEAP money and part...
It's matched by the department as well.
Yeah, so that's been 50-50.
Okay.
Well, something like that is between us and the department.
Now, something completely different. Another thing that is come up in our discussion is the ESF, the European Social Fund. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is, how it differs from the AEB, where it comes from, how long it's been in operation, and what do you think is going to happen to it in the future?
Wow, that's quite broad. It goes back further than my knowledge about how long it's been around. But it is part of the streams of funding from Europe. I mean, Michelle can go into the details, perhaps, of some of the overall budget, but essentially the bit that we're dealing with here in relation to the AEB is about match funding. There are very specific rules to do with that surround European money, and we have to be sure that what it's matched against meets those rules, and so we are sure that a good 10% of the AEB budget can be matched by European Social Fund money, because the outcomes it's seeking align with the criteria for that ESF money. So it'll be some £71 million over the next 4 years that we'll be able to draw down from the ESF, matched, as I say, against the same amount of money from the AEB. So effectively, we're taking that 70 odd million of the AEB and effectively doubling it by drawing down on that ESF money.
Okay, so that's sort of less than, it's about 18 million a year approximately.
Yeah,
71
so it'll be
million
an additional sort of
4 years. Okay. What do you? I mean, will that continue? Do you think with Brexit,
well, this comes,
or where will you get that money from?
I mean, all that kind of European money is at the centre of the debate about the Future Prosperity Fund, Future Prosperity Fund, Shared Prosperity Fund, which the detail of which is still to be decided by central government. I mean, obviously there are myriad strands of funding that come from Europe to all sorts of things, but particularly regeneration monies, projects across the country, and the government does accept that that has to continue, or the work needs to continue, so they need to work out how it's going to be funded, and presumably a similar sort of bid-led arrangements will need to be put in place, hence this kind of like the assumption that something like the Shared Prosperity Fund would be the mechanism with which it's replaced.
And obviously, Europe doesn't have its own money. I mean, it gets money from the
us,
UK
and
that gives it to them, and then they give it back to us. So then, is the Shared Prosperity Fund, just what goes from the UK to the EU?
Well, the trouble is, if it's all been promised to go to the NHS, then there's nothing left for the Shared Prosperity Fund. So I guess it's that argument is going to have to be had. If there are promises being made for any if money repatriated or not sent to Europe has been all hypothecated on somewhere else, then the question is raised about, well, what funds, all those things, the way we got that money back from Europe. Yeah.
Okay, but there is a possibility that will then be reallocated to London, to the AEB.
Well, it won't be to AEB, so I think those discussions will take place. I mean, just to give some scale, there's around London received from between 2014 onwards about £500 million worth of ESF funding in London, so that's quite a significant amount. The Shared Prosperity Fund obviously hasn't been determined yet by government, but conversations are taking place about how can London ensure that we don't lose out in terms of the funding we have received to support skills and a range of other things as well, as small businesses and everything else. So those discussions are ongoing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you. I mean, those questions show the split in our work programming as well from the Assembly, because I would imagine that those questions will be featured in the next cycle of the Economy Committee's programme work, because as you say, so many projects in London are dependent on this huge amount of money. We have mentioned ERDF, which although that tails off, that's got quite a long tail. And so many, certainly in my constituency, organisations are received of that. I mean, they have been given some sort of like soft assurances that there is going to be a transitional period. Having said that, talking to friends who are farmers, they've been told that all this money is going to farming. So it's like we'll have to wait and see.
I think it's been spent many times over.
It's so spent. So I'm sure that will be a focus of the next Economy Committee's programme for next year. Can I just say, excellent timing, and can I just finish by saying, in terms of this is our last meeting for this cycle. We clearly, as the panel, our brief is the AE funding to monitor that, so it's one of our standing items. So we will be meeting you again in the next year. But I just want to say thank you so much, Jules and Michelle, for the sort of collaborative, cooperative approach that we've been able to take with your members of your team, and it's enabled us, I believe, to really do better scrutiny and then influence the feedback. It's a great feedback, because I would hope that you would think that our feedback and recommendations has enabled your work to have the strength that it does.
Yeah, it's all been a very collaborative
Yeah.
process from the beginning over the last two and a half years, how we got to where we are.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, Londoners are the beneficiaries of all this, so that's great. So thank you so much, and all the best for D-Day, and we look forward to receiving your letter tomorrow and getting a copy of that letter, which we'll attach to the minutes of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
When we, as usual, Michelle, if we look through the notes and there's anything outstanding, I do hope you'll allow us to write to you for further information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can the panel note the report and the subsequent discussions today? Can we agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group leaders to agree an output arising from the discussion? Thank you. And you are recommended. Oh, I've already said that. Sorry. And then item 7, this area of work led by the wonderful Samira Islam, who I'm sure that members will support me in saying thank you to the work that you've done and all the amazing visits that you've organised and the briefings, and also to you, Polly, for your exemplary support to this committee. Thank you. Then we have got to note the topics that we've covered over the 18-19 year. Thank you. And then ask you to delegate authority to me in consultation with party leads to agree the topic of the panel's first meeting of the 2019-20 Assembly year, and agree some sort of output relating to the panel's investigation into pupils who are underachieving at school, such a key area that we heard some really great evidence from in November, and agree arrangements for any site visits, informal meetings or engagement activities before the panel's next formal meeting. Thank you. And then if members could note the summary of that very informative visit that we had to the TBAP, what was that? Give me what the full name of that? It's the the Tri-Borough.
I think they call themselves TBAP.
DPAP, okay. It's something. It's the 3 boroughs doing amazing work. TBAP, intervention centres, and so that report is attached to as Appendix 1, and then there's a briefing note on the November meeting of underachieving boys attached to Appendix 2, and that takes me to item 8, the date of next meeting. The next meeting of the panel is scheduled to be held on 19 September 2019, subject to the agreement of the Assembly's annual meeting. And at item 9, any other business, there are no urgent business, and so that concludes our meeting for today. Thank you very much, members. Send our thanks to Tony, because he's very interested and involved in this panel, and so send him our best wishes to get better and bring the meeting to an end. Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber Sound.